The cold bit through Josephine Oliver's threadbare dress like 1,000 needles as her uncle's wagon disappeared into the white swirl of the February blizzard, leaving her standing alone on the frozen trail 15 miles north of Trinidad, Colorado. She had begged him not to abandon her, pleaded that she would work harder at the ranch, promised she would eat less and complain never. But Uncle Marcus had looked at her with those cold gray eyes and told her she was nothing but a burden he could no longer afford to keep now that his new wife demanded she leave. The year was 1882, and the Rocky Mountain winter showed no mercy to anyone, least of all a 20-year-old woman with nowhere to go and no one who cared whether she lived or died. Josephine wrapped her arms around herself and tried to walk, but the wind pushed against her like an invisible wall, and the snow had already covered the wagon tracks. Her boots, worn thin at the soles, filled with ice, and her toes went numb within minutes. She had been her uncle's unpaid servant since her parents died of fever 6 years ago, cooking and cleaning and mending from dawn until long past dark, and this was her reward for all that loyalty and hard work. The betrayal burned almost as fierce as the cold, though the burning faded quickly as her body began to shut down from the exposure. She did not know how long she stumbled through the white darkness before her legs gave out. The snow felt almost soft as she collapsed into it, and a strange warmth began to creep through her limbs that made her want to sleep. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that sleeping meant dying, but dying seemed easier than fighting anymore. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the world faded to white, and then to gray, and then to nothing at all. The sound of hooves crunching through snow pulled at the edges of her consciousness, but she could not open her eyes. Strong hands lifted her from the frozen ground, and a deep voice cursed steadily as those hands brushed snow from her face and hair. "Come on now. Do not you dare die on me," the voice said, rough with urgency and something like fear. "I have got you. Just hold on." Josephine felt herself being lifted onto a horse, and then a solid warmth pressed against her back as the rider settled behind her, holding her upright with one arm while guiding the horse with the other. She tried to speak, but her jaw would not work, and her tongue felt thick and frozen in her mouth. The rider pulled her closer against his chest and urged the horse faster through the storm. Time became meaningless. She drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of sensation. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the firm grip of the arms around her, the sound of that deep voice murmuring encouragement that she could not quite make out. Then warmth, sudden and shocking as they entered some kind of shelter. The rider dismounted and carried her in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. "Easy now," he said, laying her down near something that crackled and popped. "I need to get you warm or you will lose fingers and toes, maybe worse." Josephine forced her eyes open and saw flames dancing in a stone fireplace. The shelter was a small cabin, rough-hewn but solid, with gaps in the walls chinked tight against the wind. The man kneeling beside her had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. He looked to be in his middle 20s, with a lean, weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun and nights spent sleeping on hard ground. His hands moved with swift efficiency as he pulled off her frozen boots and began rubbing her feet. "This is going to hurt," he warned, and he was right. As feeling returned to her extremities, pain exploded through her hands and feet like she had thrust them into fire instead of away from the cold. Josephine cried out and tried to pull away, but the man held her firm. I know," he said, his voice gentling. "But it means you are coming back. Stay with me." He worked on her feet until some color returned to them, then moved to her hands, chafing them between his own larger palms and breathing warm air on her fingers. Josephine watched his face as he worked, seeing the deep concentration there and the genuine concern. She did not understand why a stranger would care so much about saving her life. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper through chattering teeth. He glanced up at her face and something like relief flooded his features. "Name is Quentin Donovan. I am a horse wrangler, heading back to Trinidad from a delivery up north. Who are you, and what in blazes were you doing out in that storm alone?" Josephine Oliver. Her voice cracked and tears spilled hot down her cold cheeks. "My uncle left me there. He said he could not keep me anymore." Quentin's jaw tightened and his eyes went hard. "He left you to die. What kind of man does that? The kind who has a new wife who does not want his orphan niece around." The words tasted bitter. "I should have seen it coming. She made it clear from the day they married that I was not welcome, but I had nowhere else to go. I thought if I just worked harder, made myself useful enough, he would let me stay. I was wrong." Quentin muttered something under his breath that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary about her uncle's character and parentage. He stood and moved to a cupboard, returning with a thick woolen blanket that he wrapped around her shoulders. "You need to get out of that wet dress before the cold sets back in. I will turn my back, and you change into this." He handed her a flannel shirt that looked like it would hang to her knees. "It is clean, I promise. Saved it for town, but you need it more than I need to look presentable." He turned away and busied himself with the fire, adding more wood and adjusting the logs. Josephine's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, still clumsy with cold, but she managed to strip down to her chemise and pull on his shirt. It smelled like pine soap and leather and something else that must have been just him. She wrapped the blanket back around herself. "I am decent," she said softly. Quentin turned back and nodded approval. He hung her wet dress and boots near the fire to dry, then poured something hot from a pot into a tin cup. "Beef broth. Not fancy, but it will warm you from the inside." Josephine took the cup in both hands and sipped carefully. The salty warmth spread through her chest and belly, chasing away more of the terrible cold. She studied Quentin as he settled onto a wooden stool across from her, his own cup cradled in his hands. He had a horseshoe scar on his right forearm and calluses that spoke of hard physical labor. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, and his boots had been recently oiled. Everything about him suggested a man who took care of what was his, who worked for his living and did not complain about it. "Thank you," she said. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "Just lucky I came along when I did. This storm blew in faster than expected. I was trying to make Trinidad before it hit, but when it got too bad, I remembered this lined shack and headed for it. The rancher who owns it lets travelers use it when needed." He paused, then added quietly, "What will you do? Do you have anyone in Trinidad who can take you in?" Josephine's throat tightened. "No, I have no one anywhere. My parents are dead 6 years, and I have no siblings or other family besides Uncle Marcus. I suppose I could look for work, but I do not have references or skills beyond housekeeping and cooking. Most folks want someone who comes recommended." "You can cook." "Yes, quite well actually. My mother taught me before she died, and I have done all the cooking at my uncle's ranch for years. I can also sew and mend, keep accounts, tend a garden, preserve food, manage a household. I just never got the chance to work anywhere that would provide a proper reference." Quentin was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cup. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful. "I might know of something. There is a boarding house in Trinidad run by a widow named Mrs. Chen. Her husband was Chinese, came over to work the railroad and then stayed. She is always needing help, and she is not one to judge people by their circumstances. She judges by their character and whether they are willing to work hard. If I vouch for you, she would at least give you a chance. Hope, dangerous and fragile, flickered in Josephine's chest. You would do that, but you do not even know me. I know you got thrown out into a blizzard and kept going instead of just laying down to die, Quentin said. I know you are grateful for help instead of acting like it is owed to you. That tells me enough about your character. The rest, well, Mrs. Chen can figure that out for herself. Tears spilled over again, but this time from gratitude instead of despair. I do not know how I can ever repay you. Do not need repaying. Just pass it along someday when you see someone else who needs a hand. He stood and moved to check the fire again. Storm sounds like it is settling in for the night. We will have to wait it out here and head to town in the morning. Are you warm enough? Josephine nodded, though she shivered slightly. Quentin frowned and pulled another blanket from a trunk in the corner. He brought it over and tucked it around her, his hands gentle and impersonal, but Josephine felt her breath catch at the closeness. He smelled like horse and leather and winter air, and there was something solid and dependable about his presence that made her feel safer than she had in years. Get some sleep, he said. You have been through hell today. I will keep the fire going. What about you? You must be exhausted too. I will sleep when I know you are out of danger. He returned to his stool and settled in, apparently content to keep watch through the night. Josephine wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. She curled up on the rough cot, wrapped in blankets and wearing Quentin's shirt, and let herself drift into sleep, secure in the knowledge that someone was watching over her for the first time in a very long while. She woke to pale sunlight streaming through the gaps in the cabin walls and the smell of coffee and bacon. Quentin stood at the fireplace, tending a pan, his back to her. Josephine sat up slowly, taking stock of her body. Her hands and feet ached but moved properly, and the deep bone cold was gone. She felt weak and shaky but alive, and that was more than she had expected to be. Morning, Quentin said without turning around. How are you feeling? Sore, tired, but better. She paused. Did you sleep at all? Enough. He turned and brought over a tin plate with bacon and hardtack softened in bacon grease. Not fancy, but it will keep you going. Your dress is dry and the storm has passed. We can head out after you eat and get changed. Josephine ate the simple meal and found it delicious simply because she was alive to taste it. She changed back into her dress while Quentin stepped outside to ready his horse, then emerged into the bright winter morning. The world was transformed by the snow, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Quentin's horse, a sturdy roan gelding, stood patiently saddled and waiting. His name is Copper, Quentin said, stroking the horse's neck. He is steady and sure-footed. You will ride in front of me again if that is acceptable to you. Of course, Josephine said, feeling her cheeks warm slightly at the memory of being held against his chest during the ride to the cabin. Quentin helped her mount, his hands on her waist strong and steady, then swung up behind her. He pulled her back against him and urged Copper forward. The ride to Trinidad took several hours through the deep snow. Quentin kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling her about his work as a horse wrangler, the ranches in the area, and what she could expect from Trinidad. The town had grown considerably in recent years with the railroad coming through, he explained, and there was opportunity for those willing to work for it. He spoke with affection about Mrs. Chen, and how she had helped him when he first came to the area 5 years ago, giving him a place to stay when he was down to his last dollar, and treating him like a person instead of just another drifter. She has a good heart, Quentin said. Lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years back, but instead of giving up, she took his savings and opened the boarding house. She works harder than any 2 men I know, and she does not put up with nonsense from anyone. You will like her, I think. I hope she will like me, Josephine said softly. She will. Quentin's arms tightened slightly around her, a gesture of reassurance. Trust me." Trinidad appeared gradually, buildings rising from the snow-covered landscape. The town nestled in a valley with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising dramatically to the west. Smoke curled from dozens of chimneys, and the sounds of human activity drifted on the cold air. Horses whinnying, hammers ringing against anvils, voices calling out greetings and conducting business. It looked like a town full of life and possibility. Quentin guided Copper through the main street, nodding to people who called out greetings. Several folks gave Josephine curious looks, but Quentin paid them no mind. He rode straight to a two-story building painted pale yellow with green shutters. A sign hung above the door, "Chen's Boarding House, all welcome." A woman emerged onto the porch as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was small and sturdy, somewhere in her 40s, with black hair streaked with gray pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was weathered but kind, and her dark eyes missed nothing as she looked from Quentin to Josephine and back again. "Quentin Donovan," she said in lightly accented English. "You are late coming back. I was starting to worry." "Got caught in the storm, Mrs. Chen." "Found someone else who got caught in it too, but in much worse circumstances." Quentin dismounted and helped Josephine down, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as she found her balance. "This is Josephine Oliver. She needs a place to stay and work if you have both. I can vouch for her character." Mrs. Chen's sharp eyes took in Josephine's worn dress, the remnants of frost damage on her cheeks and hands, and the way she swayed slightly with exhaustion. "Come inside, child. You look half frozen and completely worn out. We will talk inside where it is warm." The interior of the boarding house was clean and welcoming, with the smell of baking bread filling the air. Mrs. Chen led them to a cozy kitchen and poured tea, then settled at the table and fixed Josephine with a direct stare. "Tell me your story," she said simply. Josephine told her, leaving nothing out. She explained about her parents' death, her years working for her uncle, his new wife's hostility, and finally the terrible moment when he had left her in the snow to die. Mrs. Chen's expression grew harder as the story progressed, and when Josephine finished, the older woman muttered something in Chinese that sounded distinctly unflattering. "Your uncle is a man without honor," Mrs. Chen said flatly. "He should be ashamed, but men like that rarely feel shame. You are well rid of him, though the manner of parting was cruel beyond words." She paused, studying Josephine. "Can you cook and clean as well as you say?" "Yes, madam. I can provide samples of my cooking if you wish, and I can show you my mending and other skills." "That will not be necessary yet. Quentin's word is good enough for me to give you a trial. I can offer room and board plus a small wage if your work is satisfactory. The room is tiny and the work is hard, but I treat my employees with respect and I expect the same in return. Can you start immediately?" Relief flooded through Josephine so intensely she felt dizzy. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You will not regret this, I promise. See that I do not." Mrs. Chen's stern expression softened slightly. "You look exhausted. Let me show you to your room. You can rest for today and start fresh tomorrow." She led Josephine up narrow stairs to a small room under the eaves. It contained a single bed, a washstand, a trunk for belongings, and a window that looked out over the street. It was the smallest room Josephine had ever called her own, and it was perfect. "Thank you," Josephine whispered. Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder. "Thank Quentin. He brought you here and he does not vouch for people lightly. Rest now." She left, and Josephine sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Less than 24 hours ago she had been dying in the snow, and now she had a room and a job and a chance to build a life. It seemed impossible, and yet here she was. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Quentin stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Just wanted to make sure you are settled," he said. "Mrs. Chen is tough but fair. You will do well here." "Thanks to you," Josephine said. She stood and crossed to him, looking up into his weathered face. "You saved my life twice now, once from the cold and once from having nowhere to go. I will never forget that." Quentin looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. Anyone decent would have done the same. "But you are the one who actually did it." Acting on impulse, Josephine rose on her toes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Quentin Donovan." His ears turned red and he cleared his throat. "Well, yes, you are welcome." He stepped back, then hesitated. "I will be in town for a few days, getting supplies and checking in with some ranchers about work. If you need anything, or if anyone gives you trouble, you can find me at the livery stable. Copper needs some rest before we head out again." "I will remember," Josephine said softly, wondering if she imagined the reluctance she saw in his face as he turned to leave. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Josephine threw herself into her work at the boarding house with fierce determination, grateful for the opportunity and desperate to prove herself worthy of Mrs. Chen's trust. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the dozen boarders, all men who worked at various jobs around Trinidad. Miners, railroad workers, store clerks, a school teacher. She cooked and cleaned and did laundry and mended clothes and linens until late into the evening. The work was every bit as hard as Mrs. Chen had promised, but it was different from working for her uncle. Here, her efforts were appreciated. Mrs. Chen praised her cooking and her efficient management of household tasks. The boarders thanked her for meals and complimented her bread and pies. She received the small wage Mrs. Chen had promised, money that was her own to keep for the first time in her life. And Quentin came by nearly every day, ostensibly to check on various small matters, but really, Josephine suspected, to see how she was faring. He would stop in for coffee, or offer to carry heavy loads, or repair things around the boarding house that Mrs. Chen had been meaning to get to. Josephine found herself watching for him, her heart lifting whenever she saw him walking up the street or heard his voice in the front hall. They talked during these visits, at first about simple things like the weather and town gossip, but gradually about deeper matters. Quentin told her about growing up in Kansas, the youngest of 4 brothers, and how he had headed west after his parents died, looking for something he could not quite name. He had worked as a ranch hand, then discovered a talent for working with horses, especially the wild ones that needed breaking. He was good at it, patient and gentle where other men were rough, and he had built a reputation that kept him steadily employed. Josephine told him about her childhood before her parents died, when life had been happy and full of laughter. She described her mother's garden and her father's terrible singing voice, and the way they had danced in the kitchen on Sunday evenings. She spoke of the pain of losing them, and how Uncle Marcus had seemed kind at first, but had grown cold and demanding over the years, especially after he remarried. "You deserved better," Quentin said one afternoon as they sat in the boarding house kitchen, sharing coffee while Mrs. Chen was out shopping. "You deserve people who see your worth and treat you accordingly." "I think I am finding that here," Josephine said, meeting his eyes. "Thanks to you." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition and acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first night in the line shack. Quentin reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they intertwined with hers. "Josephine," he said quietly, "I know we have not known each other long, but I cannot seem to stop thinking about you. You are on my mind from the moment I wake until I fall asleep, and you show up in my dreams too. I do not have much to offer, just my skills and whatever work I can find, but I would like the chance to court you properly if you are willing." Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. I would like that very much. Quentin's face broke into a smile that transformed him, making him look younger and lighter. Really, really, she confirmed, squeezing his hand. I think about you all the time, too. You make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I have never felt before. I know it has only been a couple of weeks, but what I feel for you is real. Then we will take our time and do this right, Quentin said. I want to build something real with you, something that lasts. They began courting with Mrs. Chen's amused blessing. Quentin took Josephine on walks through town and out into the countryside when she had free time. They attended church together on Sundays and sat on the boarding house porch in the evenings, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Quentin taught her to ride copper, patient as she learned to balance and trust the horse. Josephine baked his favorite desserts and mended his clothes when they needed repair. They discovered shared values and dreams, the desire for a home and family, a belief in hard work and honesty, a love for the wild beauty of the Colorado landscape. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new challenges. Word reached Josephine through town gossip that her uncle was telling anyone who would listen that she had run away and stolen money from him. The lie made her furious, but Quentin counseled patience. Let him talk, Quentin said. Everyone who matters knows the truth. Mrs. Chen has been spreading the real story, and folks around here respect her. Your uncle's words will not stick. But the situation came to a head one Saturday afternoon in late April when Josephine was at the general store buying supplies for the boarding house. She was examining bolts of fabric when a familiar cold voice spoke behind her. So this is where you ended up, living in a Chinese woman's boarding house, working as a servant. I suppose it suits you. Josephine turned to face Uncle Marcus. He looked older than she remembered, his face lined and his eyes hard. His new wife stood beside him, a pinched-looking woman with a sour expression. I am earning honest wages for honest work, Josephine said, keeping her voice steady though her hands trembled. More than I ever got from you. You ungrateful girl, Marcus snapped. I took you in when you had nothing, fed and housed you for years, and you repay me by stealing and running off in the middle of the night. That is a lie and you know it, Josephine said, anger overriding her fear. You left me to die in a blizzard because your wife did not want me around. If Quentin had not found me, I would be dead and frozen in the snow. You tried to murder me, Uncle, and now you are trying to ruin my reputation to cover your own guilt. Several other shoppers had stopped to listen, and Marcus's face flushed dark red. How dare you speak to me that way? You owe me everything. She owes you nothing. Quentin's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stepped into the store, moving to stand beside Josephine. His hand rested on her lower back, a gesture of support and solidarity. I was there, Marcus Oliver, Quentin continued, his voice hard as stone. I found her half dead in the snow, miles from anywhere with no supplies and no shelter. I know exactly what you did, and so does everyone else in this town who is worth knowing. You have no claim on her, moral or legal. She is an adult and she is free of you. If you keep spreading lies about her, I will make sure everyone knows the truth of what you tried to do. Marcus sputtered, looking between Quentin and Josephine. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently. He finally sneered and said, She is not worth the trouble. Keep her if you want damaged goods. Quentin's fist connected with Marcus's jaw before Josephine could blink. The older man staggered back, crashing into a display of canned goods. Blood trickled from his split lip. Get out, Quentin said quietly, but with such menace that Marcus scrambled to his feet and fled, his wife scurrying after him. The store owner, old Mr. Peterson, chuckled from behind the counter. About time someone did that. Marcus Oliver has been asking for a punch in the mouth for years. No charge for the damaged goods, he added, nodding at the dented cans. Quentin paid for Josephine's supplies and walked her back to the boarding house, his hand still at her back. Once they were alone on the porch, Josephine threw her arms around him and held on tight. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for standing up for me, for believing me." "Always," Quentin said, wrapping his arms around her. "I will always stand with you, Josephine. I love you." The words hung in the spring air, precious and perfect. Josephine pulled back just enough to look up at his face. "I love you too," she said. "So much it scares me sometimes." Quentin cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was her first kiss, and it felt like coming home. Summer arrived with warm sunshine and longer days. Quentin's work took him away for stretches of time, breaking horses for various ranchers, but he always came back to Josephine. He wrote her letters when he was away, fumbling but heartfelt declarations of his feelings and descriptions of his work. Josephine treasured every one, reading them until she had them memorized. In August, on a warm evening with fireflies dancing in the dusk, Quentin asked her to marry him. They sat on the hillside above town, looking down at the lights beginning to glow in windows. "I know I am not much," Quentin said, turning the hat in his hands nervously. "I do not have land or a fancy house or much money saved, but I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. Will you marry me, Josephine?" "Yes," she said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple silver with a small blue stone. "It was my mother's. It is the only thing of value I own, and I would be honored if you would wear it." Josephine held out her hand, trembling, and Quentin slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They married in September, a simple ceremony at the small church in Trinidad. Mrs. Chen stood up with Josephine, and another horse wrangler named Sam stood with Quentin. Josephine wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Mrs. Chen had given her as a wedding gift, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Quentin wore his best clothes and looked so handsome that Josephine could hardly breathe when she saw him waiting at the altar. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever life brought them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin kissed her to the applause of the small congregation, mostly boarders from Mrs. Chen's and a few friends Quentin had made in town. They moved into a small house on the edge of Trinidad, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Quentin had saved every penny he could and bartered work for materials, and together they made it into a home. Josephine planted a garden and made curtains for the windows. Quentin built furniture in the evenings, rough but sturdy pieces that would last. They were poor in money but rich in love and happiness. Josephine continued working at the boarding house a few days a week, both because they needed the income and because she enjoyed the work and Mrs. Chen's company. Quentin took jobs wrangling horses, sometimes gone for a week or 2 at a time, but he always came home to her, usually bearing some small gift, wildflowers, a pretty stone, a ribbon for her hair. Their first winter as husband and wife was hard. Money was tight and work scarce during the cold months. They burned every stick of wood they could find and huddled together under blankets, but they were happy. Quentin held her close on the coldest nights and reminded her of that first night in the line shack when he had warmed her back to life by the fire. "You saved me that night," Josephine murmured against his chest. "But you have saved me every day since too, just by loving me and choosing me." "You saved me right back," Quentin said, pressing a kiss to her hair. I was drifting before I found you, just moving from job to job with no real purpose. You gave me something to work for, someone to come home to. You made me want to be better, to build something that matters. Spring came again, bringing with it better weather and more work. Quentin's reputation as a skilled horse wrangler continued to grow, and he started getting calls from ranchers farther away, jobs that paid better but kept him away longer. Josephine hated the separations but understood the necessity. They were saving money, building toward a future where Quentin might buy land and start his own small ranch, raising and training horses instead of traveling to do the work. In June, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She told Quentin on a warm evening as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset. For a moment he was utterly still, and then he let out a whoop of joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before carefully setting her down and checking anxiously that he had not hurt her. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "An actual baby, our baby." "Our baby," Josephine confirmed, smiling through happy tears. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Quentin said. He knelt and pressed his face against her still flat belly. "Hello in there, little one. I am your papa, and I already love you more than I can say." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and into fall. Josephine continued working at the boarding house until she grew too large and tired, at which point Mrs. Chen insisted she rest. Quentin fussed over her constantly, worried about every twinge and ache, driving her to fond exasperation. He took only local jobs that allowed him to come home every night, unwilling to be far from her. Their son was born on a cold February night, exactly 2 years after Quentin had found Josephine freezing in the snow. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Mrs. Chen and the local midwife, and there were moments when Josephine thought she might not survive it. But as dawn broke over the mountains, her son entered the world with a fierce cry that announced his presence to all who would listen. Quentin, who had been pacing outside in the cold, was allowed in to meet his child. He looked at the tiny red-faced baby in Josephine's arms with an expression of such overwhelming love and awe that Josephine fell in love with him all over again. "He is perfect," Quentin whispered, carefully touching one tiny fist. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, finally settling on one that felt right. "Thomas," Josephine said. "Thomas Michael Donovan, after both our fathers." "Thomas," Quentin repeated, testing the name. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, son." The baby wrapped his tiny fingers around Quentin's much larger one, and Josephine saw tears streak down her husband's weathered cheeks. Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful, and terrifying all at once. Thomas was a healthy, hungry infant with powerful lungs, and a determination to make his needs known. Josephine spent her days nursing and changing and soothing, while Quentin worked longer hours to support his growing family. But the moments when they sat together in the evening, Quentin holding his son while Josephine leaned against his shoulder, made all the exhaustion worthwhile. Money remained tight, but by the time Thomas was walking, Quentin had saved enough to make an offer on a piece of land just outside Trinidad. It was not large, just 20 acres, but it had good water and grazing and enough space to build. The owner, an elderly rancher looking to retire, sold it to them for a price they could almost afford, accepting payments over time. They moved to the land that spring, living in a large tent while Quentin built a house. It took all summer, with Quentin working on construction whenever he was not earning money at other jobs. Neighbors helped, repaying favors Quentin had done for them or simply pitching in because that was what people did. By autumn, they had a small but solid house, with room for their family and space to grow. Quentin started his horse wrangling business properly, building corrals and a small barn. Word spread that Quentin Donovan could gentle the wildest horses without breaking their spirit, and ranchers began bringing him animals to work with. The money was not steady, but it was better than traveling constantly, and Quentin was home every night for dinner and to help with Thomas. Josephine planted an extensive garden and started raising chickens. She took in sewing and mending from town, and occasionally still helped Mrs. Chen when the boarding house was especially busy. She was happier than she had ever imagined possible, watching her son grow and working side by side with her husband to build something that was truly theirs. 2 years after Thomas was born, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Lucy Rose. She was smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, with Quentin's dark hair and Josephine's green eyes. Quentin was utterly smitten, holding his daughter for hours and singing to her in a low, rumbling voice that put her right to sleep. "I have everything I need right here," Quentin said one evening, holding Lucy while Thomas played at his feet and Josephine prepared supper. "My own land, my own business, my beautiful wife, and 2 healthy children. A few years ago I was a drifter with nothing, and now look at what we have built." "We built it together," Josephine reminded him. She came over and kissed his cheek, then ruffled Thomas's hair. "This is our dream come true." The years rolled on, bringing challenges and joys in equal measure. There were hard winters when money ran short and summers when drought made water scarce. Thomas broke his arm falling from a tree, and Lucy caught pneumonia one terrible winter, fighting for days before finally recovering. But there were more good times than bad. Birthdays celebrated with cakes and small gifts, Christmases around the fireplace, summer evenings spent outside watching the stars come out. Quentin's business grew steadily. He became known throughout southern Colorado as the man to see about problem horses, and he began training young men in his methods, passing on his knowledge. Josephine's garden flourished, providing most of their food, and her sewing brought in steady supplemental income. They paid off the land and built additions onto the house as the children grew. On a February evening, 8 years after Quentin had found Josephine dying in the snow, they sat on their porch watching their children play in the last light of day. Thomas, now 6, was teaching 4-year-old Lucy to identify different bird calls. Inside, a third child, their youngest son James, slept peacefully in his cradle. "You ever think about that night?" Josephine asked quietly. "When you found me?" "Sometimes," Quentin admitted. He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in the familiar gesture he had done thousands of times over the years. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you. If the storm had blown in an hour earlier, or if I had taken a different route, or if I had decided to push on toward town instead of stopping at the line shack. So many small things that had to happen exactly right for our paths to cross." "I used to have nightmares about that night," Josephine said. "The cold, the fear, the certainty that I was going to die alone and forgotten. But now, when I think about it, I remember the feeling of being lifted onto your horse and your voice telling me to hold on. That is what saved me, even more than the fire. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." "You fought for yourself," Quentin said. "I just provided the opportunity. Everything that came after, building this life together, that is all you. Your strength, your determination, your love. You amaze me every single day." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Their children's laughter drifted on the evening air, and smoke rose from the chimney of their sturdy house. She thought about Uncle Marcus, who she had not seen or heard from in years, and felt only pity for the bitter life he must be living. She thought about that desperate, frozen girl stumbling through the blizzard, and wanted to tell her that it would be all right, that rescue was coming. that life held joy and love beyond anything she could imagine. "I love you," she said to Quentin, the words as true and vital as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too," he replied, pulling her closer. "From that first moment I saw you in the snow until my last breath, I will love you." The children ran up onto the porch, Thomas chattering excitedly about a hawk he had seen and Lucy demanding to be picked up. Quentin scooped up his daughter while Josephine listened to Thomas's story, and together they went inside to the warmth and light of their home. Years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Thomas showed an aptitude for working with animals like his father and began helping with the horse training as soon as he was old enough. Lucy inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread and also showed talent for drawing and painting. James, the youngest, proved to be the family's scholar, constantly asking questions and learning to read before he was 5. The little horse ranch prospered. Quentin took on 2 permanent employees to help with the increased work, young men he trained personally in his patient methods. Josephine's garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes, and she began selling preserves and baked goods in town, developing a reputation for quality that brought in steady customers. They built a new barn and expanded the house again, adding a proper parlor and individual bedrooms for the children. It was not a mansion by any means, but it was comfortable and solid, filled with handmade furniture and quilts, children's drawings on the walls, and the warm clutter of a life well lived. Mrs. Chen remained a close friend, visiting regularly and treating the Donovan children like her own grandchildren, since she had none of her own. She finally sold the boarding house when her health began to fail and moved into a small cottage near their ranch, where Josephine could check on her daily and the children could visit whenever they liked. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quentin surprised Josephine with a gift he had been working on secretly for months. He led her out to the hillside where he had proposed, and there stood a small gazebo he had built with his own hands. It was beautifully crafted, with carved details and a bench that wrapped around the inside. "I wanted you to have a special place," Quentin said, suddenly shy. "Somewhere you can come when you need a moment of peace, where you can sit and look out over everything we have built. I know life is busy and loud with 3 children and the ranch and everything else. This can be your refuge." Josephine was crying before he finished speaking. She threw her arms around him and held tight. "It is perfect. You are perfect. How did I get so lucky?" "I am the lucky one," Quentin insisted. "Every single day I wake up grateful that I rode down that particular trail on that particular night. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They renewed their wedding vows that day, just the 2 of them on the hillside with the mountains as witnesses. They spoke the same words they had said 10 years before, but now they carried the weight of a decade of love and partnership, of challenges faced together and joys shared. When they kissed, it was with the passion of new lovers and the deep comfort of old friends. The children grew into teenagers, each finding their path. Thomas, at 16, was already handling difficult horses on his own and talking about expanding the business. Lucy, at 14, had sold several of her paintings and was saving money for art school in Denver. James, at 12, had announced his intention to become a doctor, inspired by the country physician who had tended the family through various illnesses and injuries over the years. Quentin and Josephine watched their children with pride and occasional bewilderment. They had given them something neither of them had fully known as children, a stable, loving home where they were valued and encouraged to pursue their dreams. The children knew their mother's story, how she had nearly died and been saved by their father's courage and kindness. They understood that the life they had was built on hard work and determination, and love that refused to give up even in the hardest moments. One winter evening, gathered around the fireplace with the whole family, Thomas asked his father to tell the story of finding their mother in the snow. It had become a family legend, told and retold over the years, but the children never tired of hearing it. Quentin looked at Josephine, who nodded permission. He pulled her close against his side and began the tale, describing the blizzard and how he had almost missed seeing the figure collapsed in the snow. He spoke of the desperate race to the lined shack, and the long night of keeping the fire burning while willing Josephine to survive. I knew when I looked down at her face that first time, even frozen and unconscious, that she was someone special, Quentin said. I told myself I was just helping someone in trouble, doing what any decent person would do. But even then, something in my heart was claiming her as mine to protect and care for. And I knew when I finally opened my eyes and saw you tending the fire that you were the answer to prayers. I had not even known how to pray, Josephine added. You could have left me at Mrs. Chen's boarding house and gone on with your life, but you stayed. You kept coming back. You chose me every day, and you still do. Always, Quentin confirmed, kissing her temple. Every day for the rest of my life I choose you, Lucy sighed dramatically. You two are so romantic it is almost embarrassing. You will understand someday, Josephine said with a smile. When you find someone who sees you for who you really are and loves you not despite your flaws but including them. Someone who would ride through a blizzard for you, or build you a gazebo, or simply hold your hand when life gets hard. That is what you should hold out for. The children groaned good-naturedly, but Josephine saw Thomas nodding thoughtfully and knew her son had listened. James was drawing something in his notebook, probably sketching the scene of his father finding his mother. Lucy stared into the fire with the dreamy expression that meant she was composing a painting in her mind. More years passed, bringing graduations and courtships and new grandchildren. Thomas married a rancher's daughter and brought her to work the growing horse business alongside him. Lucy did go to art school and returned with a husband who was a photographer, the two of them setting up a studio in Trinidad. James went to medical school in Denver, supported by his parents and siblings, and returned as Dr. James Donovan, ready to serve the community that had raised him. Quentin and Josephine became grandparents, then grandparents again and again. They watched their children build their own lives and families, passing on the values of hard work, honesty, and love that had sustained their own marriage. The Little Horse Ranch became Donovan Ranch, known throughout Colorado as a place where horses were treated with respect and trained with patience. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully at the age of 78, surrounded by the Donovan family who had become her family. They buried her in the Trinidad cemetery with full honors, and everyone who spoke at her funeral mentioned her kindness and her willingness to give people second chances. Josephine credited her with providing the opportunity that had allowed her new life to take root and flourish. On a cold February evening, 30 years after Quentin had found Josephine in the snow, they sat together in the gazebo he had built, wrapped in heavy blankets and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. They were both past 50 now, their hair streaked with gray and their bodies marked by decades of hard work. But their hands were still linked, and their love was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered 30 years of life together. 30 years, Josephine marveled. It seems impossible that so much time has passed, and yet I remember that night like it was yesterday. Best night of my life, Quentin said, even if I did not know it at the time. riding through that blizzard, freezing and miserable and cursing the weather, not knowing that I was about to find my whole future lying in the snow. "Do you have any regrets?" Josephine asked. "We have had a good life, but it has not been easy. We have struggled for money and worried about the children and dealt with drought and disease and all the challenges that come with ranching. Do you ever wish you had chosen a different path?" Quentin was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "Not one single regret. Every hardship we faced together, and that made it bearable. Every joy was doubled because I got to share it with you. If I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a single thing because every choice led me to you and to this life we have built." Tears slipped down Josephine's weathered cheeks. "I feel the same way. Even that terrible night when Uncle Marcus left me to die, I cannot fully regret it now, because it brought me to you. You warmed me back to life with fire, but you have kept me warm every day since with your love." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Through the windows of the house below, they could see their family gathering for dinner, children and grandchildren, laughter and love filling every room. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the smell of Josephine's stew and fresh bread. "We should head down," Quentin said eventually. "They will be waiting for us." "In a moment," Josephine said. "I just want to stay here with you a little longer, remembering how far we have come and how blessed we have been." Quentin pulled her closer, and they watched the first stars appear above the mountains they had called home for 3 decades. Below them, the ranch glowed with light and warmth, a testament to the life they had built from almost nothing. Two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and created something beautiful that would outlast them both. When they finally walked down the hill to their home, hand in hand as they had been for 30 years, the family welcomed them with hugs and warm plates of food. The grandchildren clamored for stories, and Quentin obliged, telling tales of wild horses and hard winters while Josephine sat beside him, adding details and laughing at the parts he embellished. That night, lying in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, Josephine curled against Quentin's side the way she had since their wedding night. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her, "forever and always." Outside, the Colorado wind sang through the mountains, cold and wild. But inside, warmed by love and the fire in the hearth, the Donovan family was safe and happy and together. From the desperate girl freezing in the snow to the matriarch of a thriving ranch, Josephine's journey had been long and sometimes difficult. But every step had been worth it. Every hardship overcome had made the joy sweeter, and every day spent with the man who had saved her life and then built a life with her was a gift beyond measure. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the house, just as Quentin's love had spread through Josephine's life, warming every corner and casting light into places that had been dark and cold. From that first fire in the line shack to this fire in their home, surrounded by the family they had created, the warmth had never faded. And it never would, not as long as they had each other.